When a powerful Chinese billionaire loses everything in a single day, money, reputation, and even identity, he finds himself stranded in a quiet American cafe where no one believes who he is. Mocked, ignored, and desperate, he's moments from breaking, until a waitress's young daughter greets him in Chinese. 3 simple words that reignite his humanity and change both their lives forever. Before we unfold this powerful story of loss, kindness, and redemption, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because sometimes, one simple act of humanity can change a life forever. For 20 years, Li Wei was the man everyone wanted to be. He walked through mirrored lobbies where people straightened their ties at his reflection. Every handshake he offered carried promise, and every word he spoke could move markets. Reporters called him the Iron Visionary of Shanghai. But behind that calm precision, Li Wei had built a world so fragile, even a whisper could shatter it. The whisper came on a Thursday. It started as a rumor on a finance blog. Then, by sunset, it was everywhere. Li Industries accused of falsifying revenue reports. By midnight, shareholders were demanding answers. Li Wei didn't blink. He'd weathered storms before. He believed power was about control. He just didn't realize how quickly control could vanish when trust evaporated. By morning, his boardroom looked different. The same men who once applauded him now avoided his gaze. His lawyers stopped returning calls. His wife sent a short message. Our son saw the news. We need space. That single sentence hit harder than any headline. He stood by his office window as rain slid down the glass, blurring the skyline that had once been his empire. Outside, lightning cracked open the sky, a perfect reflection of the chaos within. For the first time, Li Wei felt something he had long considered weakness, fear. He didn't wait for explanations or investigations. He packed a suitcase with a few shirts, his passport, and a flash drive containing what he called his real legacy. Then, quietly, he booked a one-way ticket to America. The next day, the great Li Wei vanished from Shanghai. The flight to Seattle was long and silent, the kind of silence that sits heavy on your chest. He stared out the window at the clouds below, trying to make sense of what was left of his life. He ordered only water, though he could have had champagne. His mind replayed every decision, the deals, the betrayals, the pride. Somewhere between time zones, he whispered to himself, maybe this is the price. When the plane landed, it was still raining, softer, colder. Seattle rain didn't roar like Shanghai's. It whispered, like a secret only the broken could hear. Li Wei stepped out of the terminal with a single suitcase and no destination. He told himself he would start over. Maybe buy a small property, open a quiet company, stay unnoticed until things cleared. He didn't know that fate had already chosen a different script for him. The taxi ride from the airport was silent except for the driver's voice. First time here? The man asked. Li Wei nodded. Yes, business trip. Then you came to the right city, the driver chuckled. It rains every day. Washes away everything. Li Wei smiled faintly at that. Maybe that's what I need. The driver dropped him off at a hotel downtown. It was expensive, glass-fronted, and anonymous, just like the man he used to be. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and indifference. He handed his black credit card to the receptionist, who smiled automatically and swiped it. The smile vanished a second later. I'm sorry, sir. It seems this card isn't going through. Li Wei frowned. Try again. She did. Then tried another. And another. Each time, the same small sound of denial. Beep, decline, beep, decline. Finally, she looked up, polite but detached. Maybe you should contact your bank, sir. For a moment, Li Wei just stood there, holding the useless card between his fingers. He could feel people in the lobby looking. He'd been the man others admired, envied, even feared. Now he was just another stranger whose money didn't work. He nodded slowly, whispered, "Thank you," and walked out into the rain. Outside, he sat on a wet bench and watched the city move around him. Nobody noticed the man in the soaked designer suit. No one cared who he was, what he'd built, or what he'd lost. His phone battery blinked red, then died. He stared at the black screen, seeing his own reflection. Pale, tired, small. For a long time, he didn't move. When the rain began to turn colder, he stood and started walking without direction. The streets glowed with neon lights reflected in puddles. A corner store buzzed faintly. Somewhere, jazz music floated from a half-open cafe door. He turned his head and saw it. A warm, small place with yellow light spilling from inside, painting a soft square on the pavement. The sign above read, Harbor Light Cafe. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the door. Inside, the smell of coffee and baked bread filled the air. A bell jingled gently behind him. The cafe was nearly empty, a couple whispering in one corner, an old man reading a newspaper, a waitress cleaning the counter. The woman looked up briefly, then back to her work. She was in her 30s, plain clothes, tired eyes. Her name tag read, Sarah. Sit wherever you like, she said without looking up. Li Wei nodded and chose a corner table near the window. He placed his wet suitcase beside him and waited. Sarah approached with a small pad in her hand. What can I get you? He looked at the menu for a long time, though he couldn't read half of it through the blur of exhaustion. Just coffee, he said finally. Cream or sugar? No. Black. She scribbled, nodded, and left. For the first time since his fall, Li Wei exhaled deeply. The hum of conversation, the smell of roasting beans, the clink of a spoon, all felt strangely grounding. He reached for his wallet. Inside, only a few American bills and his Chinese ID card. He'd wired most of his assets to legal accounts before leaving, but he hadn't realized how quickly those wires could freeze. He checked his phone again. Dead, lifeless. Like everything else he'd once relied on, Sarah returned with the coffee and a receipt. $5.75. Li Wei counted his bills, barely enough for the drink. He smiled apologetically. Can I pay later, my card? Her expression didn't change. I'm sorry, sir. We don't do tabs. I understand, he said softly, pushing forward the last of his cash. As she walked away, a quiet shame spread through him, unfamiliar and sharp. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals, lectured at universities, spoken about success and humility. But he'd never truly tasted humility until now. He sat there for hours watching the rain slide down the window pane, his untouched coffee growing cold. And then, something shifted. Li Wei sat in silence, his eyes lost in the rain outside. Every drop seemed to echo the chaos he had left behind. He thought of the hundreds of employees who once waited for his approval, the meetings that began only when he arrived, the world that once revolved around his name. Now, the world kept moving, and he was invisible inside it. The cafe door chimed as a gust of wind brought in a small figure, a girl, maybe 10 years old, wearing a school uniform slightly too big for her. She shook the rain from her hair and smiled at the waitress, who looked up and sighed with relief. You're late again, Sarah said gently. I told you to stay at your friend's until I finish my shift. There was too much rain, Mama, the girl said, slipping behind the counter. I didn't want to walk in the dark, Sarah's expression softened. All right, sit down and do your homework. I'll make you some cocoa. The girl nodded, pulling out a small notebook. She looked around the cafe curiously, the kind of wide-eyed curiosity that adults forget. Her gaze stopped at Li Wei, the man sitting alone in the corner, his hands wrapped around a cup he hadn't touched. She tilted her head. There was something different about him. Not scary, not strange, just quiet in a way that felt heavy. Sarah followed her daughter's glance. Don't stare, Aisha, she whispered. Some people just need space. But he looks sad, the girl said softly. Everyone looks sad here when it rains, her mother replied, brushing crumbs off a plate. Now homework. But Aisha couldn't stop glancing at the man in the corner. His posture was perfect but defeated, like a king sitting on a broken throne. She noticed his suit, wrinkled, expensive, but soaked. His shoes were polished, yet the soles looked worn. When he lifted his cup, she caught a glimpse of his wristwatch, the kind of watch that costs more than a house. Maybe he's lost, she whispered under her breath. Li Wei looked up just then, as if hearing her thought. Their eyes met. The girl smiled shyly, and he, almost instinctively, nodded back. It was the first human connection he had felt in days. Sarah noticed the exchange. "Don't bother the customers," she said quickly. "I wasn't," Aisha murmured. "I was just being polite," Sarah sighed. "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes people don't want to talk." Li Wei returned his gaze to the window. The rain had slowed now, turning into a soft drizzle. The lights outside shimmered like liquid gold on the wet pavement. For the first time, he felt a small warmth. Not from the coffee, but from the quiet chatter of the café, the smell of cinnamon, the sound of a mother scolding her daughter gently. This was the kind of life he had never known, simple, ordinary, human. He remembered his own son, same age maybe. A boy raised in private schools, surrounded by tutors and technology but starved of time. He thought about the last words his wife had sent. "Our son saw the news." He wondered what the boy thought of him now. Aisha suddenly spoke again, breaking his thoughts. "Mama, how do you say hello in Chinese?" Sarah frowned. "Why do you want to know that?" "I heard a song at school. It had words like ni hao." "I think it means hello," Sarah chuckled. "Maybe. You should ask your teacher." Aisha nodded and went back to her notebook, humming a tune. Li Wei couldn't help but smile slightly at the sound. It was an old folk melody, Chinese, though the girl was humming it wrong. Still, something about it pierced straight through his chest. Time passed. The other customers left. The lights dimmed slightly, leaving only a few golden lamps glowing above the tables. Sarah began stacking chairs on the empty ones, glancing now and then at the man who hadn't moved since he came in. She finally approached him. "Sir, we're closing soon." Li Wei blinked, realizing how long he'd been sitting there. "Ah, I'm sorry." He reached for his suitcase, but hesitated. "Is there a place nearby? Where I could stay? A motel, maybe?" Sarah hesitated. "There's one down the street. Not great, but safe enough. You should be able to find a room." He nodded, grateful. "Thank you." She looked at him more closely now. His accent was noticeable, but his English was precise. His clothes, though soaked, were tailored. Everything about him felt misplaced, like he belonged to a world that had suddenly expelled him. When he stood, he swayed slightly. From exhaustion or hunger, she couldn't tell. Without thinking, she said, "You should eat something before you go. We've got leftover soup. It's not fresh, but it's warm." He shook his head politely. "I have already taken much of your time." "It's fine," she said. "I'd rather not throw it out." For a moment, he looked torn between pride and gratitude. Then he nodded once. "Thank you." She brought the soup in a small bowl. He picked up the spoon carefully, like a man handling something sacred. Aisha peeked from behind the counter, watching as he took slow, measured bites. She noticed how he closed his eyes every few seconds, as if trying to memorize the taste of kindness. When he finished, he stood again. "That was very kind of you." Sarah waved her hand. "Don't mention it. Just try to get some rest." He gave a small bow, an old habit from home, and turned toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, Aisha called out softly, "Zaijian." The word wasn't perfect, her pronunciation clumsy, her tone unsure, but it froze him in place. He turned slowly. "What did you say?" Aisha bit her lip, suddenly nervous. I think it means goodbye? Or hello? I'm not sure." He stared at her, eyes wide as something inside him cracked open. For days he had walked unseen, unheard, just a shadow of a man. And now, out of nowhere, a child had spoken his language. 3 simple syllables that reminded him he still existed. Sarah looked confused. "What does that mean?" she asked. Li Wei's voice trembled when he answered. "It means goodbye, but also see you again." He smiled at Aisha, and she smiled back, bright and genuine. In that tiny cafe, amid the smell of cocoa and rain, the world shifted for him. He walked out into the night with the smallest of smiles, unaware that this brief encounter would alter not only his path, but the future of everyone in that little shop. The next morning, Sunlight tried to break through the gray Seattle clouds, but never quite succeeded. The city looked washed, raw, and new. Sarah unlocked the cafe door, yawning, her thoughts still halfway between sleep and work. The bell above the door jingled softly as she flipped the sign to open. Aisha trailed behind her, clutching her backpack and a book she'd been reading on the bus. "Mama," she said, "do you think that man found a place to stay?" Sarah paused while switching on the coffee machine. "Probably," she said, though the answer didn't sound convincing even to her. "He looked smart enough to figure something out." Aisha nodded, though her small brows stayed furrowed. She hadn't stopped thinking about the man who looked both strong and fragile at the same time. The way his voice broke when he translated her words still echoed in her mind. Hours passed in the rhythm of ordinary life, the hiss of the espresso machine, the dull chatter of regular customers, the quiet comfort of routine. Then, sometime after noon, the bell chimed again. Sarah looked up automatically, a practiced smile on her face that froze halfway. Standing in the doorway was the same man, Li Wei, his suit freshly pressed, his expression calm yet humble. In his hands was a small paper bag and a folded umbrella dripping faintly onto the mat. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "I hope I am not intruding," Aisha gasped. "You came back!" Sarah blinked in surprise but quickly recovered. "Welcome back. Coffee again?" "Please," he said, taking the same corner seat. "And may I also have whatever you recommend for lunch?" Sarah nodded and turned toward the counter, whispering, "He remembered us." Aisha grinned. "Maybe he liked my Chinese." Li Wei heard and smiled faintly. "Your pronunciation was honest," he said. "That is rarer than perfect." Aisha beamed, not entirely sure what he meant, but sensing it was something kind. While Sarah worked, Li Wei looked around the cafe. It was small, modest, yet filled with life. A couple of students studied by the window. A delivery driver came and went. Every corner held a story. He found himself studying the small framed photos on the wall, Sarah and Aisha in front of the same cafe years ago, a younger Sarah with shorter hair, holding her baby girl. When the food arrived, a simple bowl of soup and a sandwich, he said quietly, "Thank you for your kindness last night." Sarah shrugged. "You looked like you needed a break." "I did," he admitted. "In my country, we say when you fall into the river, you learn who can swim beside you." "You swam beside a stranger," she smiled faintly. "It was just soup," he shook his head. "Nothing is just anything when you have nothing else." The words hung between them, soft but heavy. Sarah felt something shift, an understanding that this man's story went deeper than lost credit cards. Aisha leaned on the counter. "What's your name, mister?" "Li Wei," he said. "And you are Aisha, the brave girl who speaks foreign tongues." She giggled. "Mama says I talk too much in every tongue." He laughed quietly. It was a small sound, but it carried relief, as if laughter had been locked inside him for years. Sarah joined in. "She does, but it keeps the place alive." They spoke lightly for a few minutes. Then business picked up, and Sarah excused herself to help a new rush of customers. Li Wei watched her move through the crowd with quiet efficiency. She had the poise of someone who had learned strength through necessity. When the cafe slowed again, he approached the counter and placed a crisp envelope beside the register. "For yesterday's meal," he said, "and for today's hospitality." Sarah frowned. "You already paid." "This is for the kindness, not the coffee," he said softly. She hesitated, then pushed the envelope back toward him. "You don't owe us anything. Besides, people don't do things for tips here. We do them because it's right." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, almost in respect. "Then allow me another way to repay." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" He smiled gently. "Teach me how to live quietly." She laughed, unsure if he was joking, but his eyes were serious, almost pleading. "You're doing fine," she said. "You just need coffee and patience." "Coffee I can buy," he said. "Patience. I will need lessons." Before she could answer, Aisha ran up, waving her notebook. "Mr. Li, look! I learned how to write hello in Chinese." On the page, in uneven strokes, she had written ni hao, Li Wei looked at the characters for a long moment, his throat tightening. "Perfect," he whispered. "Better than perfect." He reached into the paper bag he'd brought and pulled out two small items wrapped in silk tissue, a delicate green pendant shaped like a leaf and a small carved stone turtle. "In my culture," he said, handing the pendant to Sarah, "jade means safety. For you." He gave the turtle to Aisha. "And this. Slow steps, long journey." Sarah started to protest. "Mr. Li, you can't," he raised a hand. "Please, they are old things, not expensive. But they belong with people who remind me that the world is not entirely unkind." Sarah studied his face, trying to read the truth behind his calm tone. She saw exhaustion, yes, but also grace. Something about him felt bigger than the small cafe could hold. She accepted the gifts quietly. "Thank you," she said at last. Li Wei smiled. "No, thank you." He gathered his umbrella and stood to leave. As he reached the door, Aisha called out again, "Zaijian!" This time he turned with a full smile. "Zaijian Xiaomei," he said softly. "Goodbye, little sister." Then he stepped back into the Seattle rain. Sarah watched him go, feeling a weight she couldn't explain. Something told her this wasn't the end of his visits. It was the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. Days turned into a quiet pattern of rain and return. Li Wei came back to the cafe every afternoon, always at the same table, always ordering the same black coffee. At first, Sarah thought he was just another lonely traveler who had found comfort in a warm corner. But soon she began to notice little things. How he wiped the table clean before leaving. How he watched the world as if memorizing it. How he always left the smallest folded paper cranes beside his cup. Aisha loved those cranes. Every day she collected them, adding them to a growing line on the windowsill. "They're lucky," she told her mother. "He said each one means a wish that can't be bought." Sarah would smile and say, "Then let's hope he wishes for sunshine." But in truth, Sarah looked forward to those quiet afternoons as much as her daughter did. There was something peaceful about the man. He never demanded, never complained. When the cafe got busy, he helped carry trays to tables without being asked. When the coffee machine jammed one morning, he fixed it with a calm efficiency that made Sarah blink. "You've done this before?" she asked. "In another life," he said simply. "You were a barista?" He smiled. "Not quite. But I like machines. They do what they're built for, no matter who's watching." The comment lingered in her mind long after he returned to his seat. One rainy evening, when business slowed and the last customers left, Li Wei stayed behind, quietly folding another paper crane. The lamp above their table threw soft circles of light. "Do you ever miss home?" Aisha asked him. He hesitated, the paper still between his fingers. "Every day. But sometimes you have to leave home to understand what it really means." Sarah watched his face. "You sound like someone who lost more than a house." He met her eyes for a moment, then looked away. "I lost the illusion that people stay loyal when the lights go out." For a long moment, only the rain filled the silence. Then Sarah said gently, "Sometimes you find new lights in smaller places." He smiled faintly. "Yes, sometimes the brightest ones pour coffee." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly turned to wipe a clean counter that didn't need wiping. Aisha giggled softly behind her book. As the weeks passed, a friendship began to form. Unspoken, but undeniable. Sarah started keeping a bowl of soup warm whenever the clouds darkened, knowing he'd arrive soon after. Aisha learned new Chinese words from him, scribbling them on napkins and laughing when she mispronounced them. One afternoon, while Aisha did her homework, Li Wei looked up from his notebook and asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" "A teacher," she said confidently. "Or maybe someone who travels. I want to see places that don't rain all the time," he smiled. "Then learn everything you can. Knowledge is a passport that never expires." Sarah, wiping glasses behind the counter, whispered to herself, "You sound like someone who's taught that lesson before." Li Wei looked at her. "I taught many people things that didn't matter. I'm trying to learn the ones that do." That night after closing, Sarah found an envelope taped to the cafe door. Inside was a small card written in graceful handwriting. Thank you for reminding me that value is not always measured in zeros. No signature, just another paper crane pressed flat inside. She slipped the card into her apron pocket and didn't tell anyone. A few days later, the first tremor of truth arrived. A man in a tailored coat entered the cafe while Li Wei was there. His expression changed the moment he saw him. "Mr. Li," the man said sharply, loud enough for everyone to hear. "So it's true." "You're hiding here." The room went silent. Sarah froze mid-step. Aisha's pencil rolled off the table. Li Wei stood slowly, his composure returning like armor. "I'm not hiding," he said evenly. "I'm thinking," the stranger sneered. "Thinking won't unfreeze your accounts or stop the investigations. You vanished. Do you have any idea what that did to the company?" Sarah looked between them, confused. "Company?" The man ignored her. "Reporters are tearing us apart. Investors are gone. They say you ran with the money." Li Wei's voice dropped to a calm steel. "I ran with nothing but my name." "The money ran from me," the man laughed bitterly. "Then maybe you'll finally know how the rest of us live." He turned to leave, muttering something in Mandarin that Sarah couldn't understand, but felt like a wound. The door slammed behind him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah said softly, "Is it true? Are you some kind of businessman?" Li Wei didn't look at her. "I was," he said. "Now I am just a man learning to pay for coffee." He gathered his things. "I should go." But as he reached the door, Aisha ran forward. "Wait," she said, holding out one of his paper cranes. "You forgot today's wish." He looked at it, then at her. Slowly, he smiled. "Then you keep it," he said. "Maybe the wish was never mine." He walked out into the rain again, leaving behind the faint scent of tea and the echo of secrets. Sarah stood by the window long after he disappeared into the mist. She didn't know what to think. Part of her felt betrayed, another part felt protective. But mostly she felt worry. The man who had once seemed unshakable now looked like someone standing on the edge of something deep and dark. Aisha touched her mother's hand. "He'll come back," she said simply. Sarah wanted to believe her. "I hope so, baby." Outside, the rain thickened, washing the city clean again, as if trying to give them all a second chance. For 2 days, Li Wei didn't return. The cafe felt hollow without him. The bell above the door still rang, but each sound only reminded Sarah of the silence that followed. Aisha tried to act normal, reading, humming, building tiny towers from the paper cranes, but even she kept glancing toward the corner table, waiting for the familiar stillness that used to fill it. On the third evening, just before closing, Sarah found herself staring at the rain outside, her reflection faint in the window. She didn't know why the man's absence bothered her so much. Maybe because in a city that never paused, he had somehow made time slow down. Maybe because she had seen, for once, a kind of loneliness that mirrored her own. Aisha tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, can we keep his table the same? Just in case he comes back?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, let's keep it ready." That night she dreamt of the stranger, standing in the rain, holding a paper crane that dissolved between his fingers. When she woke, the sound of thunder rolled through the early dawn. Li Wei sat on a bench by the waterfront, his umbrella useless against the wind. The water before him looked like moving steel. Behind him, the city glowed in fractured colors, blue, gold, red, all blending into a restless blur. He'd spent the past 2 days walking. No destination, just motion. He had sold his watch for cash, eaten once, slept little. He'd thought the fall from power would end with headlines. But it turned out the real fall came afterward, in the silence that followed when nobody called your name. A homeless man sat a few benches away, watching him curiously. "You new to the streets?" the man asked. Li Wei managed a tired smile. "Just visiting." "Careful," the man said, lighting a cigarette. "People who visit end up staying." Li Wei nodded, pocketing the words like a truth he already knew. He reached into his coat and pulled out one of the paper cranes he'd folded at the cafe. The edges were soft from rain. He placed it on the bench beside him and whispered, "If you survive the wind, maybe I will too." That same afternoon, the cafe door opened again. Sarah turned automatically, and her heart gave a jolt of relief. Li Wei stood there, soaked, tired, but smiling faintly. "You look like the weather," she said, trying to sound casual. "Then I should order something warm," he replied. Aisha squealed. "You're back! I told Mama you'd come." He nodded to her. "I had to return my students' homework," he said, pointing to the notebook she'd left for him to check. Sarah poured his coffee silently, studying him. His eyes were different now, less guarded, more human. "You could have told me," she said softly, "about who you are." "I didn't want to be who I was," he answered. "And I wasn't sure who I am now." She set the cup in front of him. "Sometimes being lost is how we find out." He looked at her, a spark of gratitude in his tired smile. "You speak like a teacher. Life teaches," she said. "We just listen late." They sat in companionable silence as the cafe emptied for the night. Outside, thunder rumbled again. The lights flickered once. Then the power went out. Sarah groaned. "Not again." "The storm's worse than last week." Aisha clapped her hands. "Candle time!" Li Wei stood immediately. "Where are your fuses?" "In the back," but he was already moving. Within minutes, the faint hum of the generator kicked in, bringing back a low light. When he returned, his shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hands dusted with grease. Sarah laughed softly. "You fix machines, you make cranes, you speak like a poet. What were you really before you walked into this cafe?" He looked down at his hands. A man who thought money made him safe, until it burned everything else away. Her expression softened. "And now?" "Now," he said, "I'm trying to earn something I never bought. Peace." Aisha, sitting on the counter, watched them both with a wise little smile. "You could stay here," she said. "We always need help when it storms." Sarah started to scold her, but Li Wei's face lit up with gentle amusement. "Maybe I will," he said. "At least until the sun comes back." He stayed. The following week became a rhythm of healing. Li Wei helped repair the old coffee grinder, reorganize the storage, and even taught Sarah how to balance the books more efficiently. He never spoke again about the man in the coat or the company or the scandal, but each evening after closing, he sat by the window folding cranes. Sometimes he told Aisha stories, soft tales from his childhood in a fishing village before he ever saw skyscrapers. She'd listen with wide eyes, whispering new Chinese words as he spoke them. Sarah, watching them, felt something she hadn't felt in years: safety. Not in money or plans, but in presence. But safety never lasts long. One night, long after closing, Sarah was locking up when two suited men appeared outside. Their car headlights cut through the drizzle like sharp knives. One of them knocked on the glass. "Mr. Li Wei?" the man said through the door. "We need to talk." Li Wei's face went pale. He stepped forward slowly. "Sarah, it's all right," he said quietly. "They're from the embassy." "Embassy?" she echoed, stunned. "They think I ran from justice. But justice is sometimes slower than truth." Aisha clung to her mother's apron. "What do they want?" He knelt beside her. "They want answers, and I'll give them." Sarah reached out impulsively and grabbed his wrist. "You don't have to go with them tonight. At least wait until morning." He shook his head. "Some debts must be faced in daylight. Others can only be paid in the dark." The men waited. Li Wei turned to Sarah and said quietly, "If I don't come back, thank you for the home you didn't know you gave me." Then he looked at Aisha. "Remember, Zaijian doesn't mean goodbye. It means we'll meet again." And with that, he stepped out into the rain once more. The door closed behind him, leaving only the smell of coffee, candle smoke, and the echo of hope. Sarah held her daughter close as the taillights disappeared into the storm. Neither of them spoke. They just stood there, watching the cranes by the window tremble in the draft. Morning came gray and thin, the kind of light that can't decide whether to stay or leave. Sarah barely slept. Every sound outside, the whisper of cars, the tapping of rain, felt like it might be him coming back. But the cafe door stayed silent. Aisha, bleary-eyed but stubbornly hopeful, set out the napkin dispenser and arranged the line of paper cranes by the window. "They look lonely," she murmured. "He'll come back so they won't be lonely," Sarah smiled weakly. Let's hope the world keeps its promises for once. Business moved slower that day. Regular customers asked about the polite Chinese man, and Sarah gave the same careful answer every time. He had some things to take care of. But each repetition made the words feel heavier. By afternoon, a newspaper slid through the cafe door with the usual stack of mail. Sarah didn't mean to look at it, but the photo on the front page caught her breath. Li Wei's face, slightly older in print, but unmistakable. The headline read, "Disgraced tycoon linked to global fraud. Authorities seek answers." The words blurred as she read them. Fraud, investigation, frozen assets. It painted him as a criminal mastermind, a man who had deceived half the financial world. But that wasn't the man she knew. She had seen him fold paper cranes, fix broken machines, comfort a lonely child. Aisha tugged the newspaper from her hands. "That's Mr. Li!" "Why are they writing about him?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Sometimes people write things before they know the whole story." "But it says he's bad," Aisha said, eyes wide. Sarah knelt beside her. "Baby, sometimes the world decides someone is bad before they get a chance to explain. We should wait and listen before we believe." Aisha nodded slowly, clutching the paper crane she always carried in her pocket. Evening came, and just as Sarah was closing, the bell above the door rang. Li Wei stood there again, this time without an umbrella, his clothes still damp from travel, his face drawn but calm. Sarah didn't speak. She simply locked the door behind him and turned the open sign to closed. He exhaled softly. "You saw it?" "Yes," she said. "I did." He sat at his usual table, folding his hands together. "Then you know why I left." "I know what the paper says," she replied. "I don't know what's true." He looked at her for a long moment. "The truth is, I built something too fast and trusted people too easily. They built lies around my name, and when it all collapsed, I became their shield. I signed papers I should have read twice. I believed loyalty meant safety. It did not." Sarah crossed her arms. "And you ran?" "I left before I was destroyed completely. But I didn't run from the law. I ran from shame." She studied him, her expression torn between anger and compassion. "And now?" "Now I want to face it," he said. But not as the man who thought he owned the world. As the man who learned what it feels like to be small. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Aisha appeared from behind the counter holding out a napkin with two shaky Chinese characters. "I tried to write friend," she said shyly. Li Wei's eyes glistened. "You did," he whispered. "Perfectly." He took the napkin and folded it into another crane. "Do you know what the word friend means in my language?" he asked. "It means someone who sees your heart even when the world doesn't," Aisha grinned. "Then Mama and I are your friends." He nodded slowly. "Yes, you are," Sarah's voice softened. "What happens now, Li Wei?" "I meet with the investigators tomorrow," he said. "They believe I hid money. But what I kept hidden isn't wealth, it's evidence. Proof that the corruption didn't start with me. Can you prove it?" He smiled faintly. "If the flash drive I carried from Shanghai survived the rain." Sarah felt a chill. "You still have it?" He nodded. "In my suitcase. Everything I couldn't say to the world is in that tiny piece of metal." Aisha's curiosity broke the tension. "Then you can show them you're good." Li Wei looked at her with the kind of tenderness that only the broken can give. "Goodness," he said quietly, "isn't what they decide for you. It's what you choose when no one's watching." Sarah stepped closer. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you're not alone anymore. Understand?" He hesitated, then bowed his head slightly. "I do." The wind outside picked up again, pressing against the windows like the breath of the storm returning. Inside, the three of them stood in a fragile circle of light. The fallen billionaire, the tired waitress, and the little girl who believed kindness could fix anything. It was the calm before the reckoning. The next morning arrived sharp and cold. A thin mist clung to the harbor, blurring the edges of the world. Sarah poured the first pot of coffee with hands that wouldn't stay still. Aisha sat on the counter, swinging her legs, whispering the same thing over and over like a spell. "He's coming back." He promised. He did come back, but not alone. A black sedan stopped outside and two suited investigators stepped out behind him. Li Wei looked smaller between them, but there was something different in his eyes, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Sarah rushed to unlock the door. "Mr. Li?" He smiled faintly. "Li Wei is fine. They're here to see the truth." The men entered, one carrying a laptop, the other a folder thick with papers. The taller one introduced himself in clipped tones. "Mr. Li, you claim to possess evidence disproving the charges. May we proceed?" Li Wei nodded. He placed his small, battered suitcase on the table and drew out a flash drive. His fingers trembled slightly. Sarah and Aisha watched from behind the counter as the men connected the drive. Lines of code and spreadsheets filled the screen, numbers moving faster than eyes could follow. "This data," Li Wei said, "shows the offshore accounts were created without my authorization. These transactions? See those signatures? They're copies, not originals. My own assistant, the one who accused me, used my credentials to mask his trail." The investigators exchanged a look. The younger one adjusted his glasses. "Can you prove that?" Li Wei leaned forward. "There's a pattern in the timestamps. Every forged entry was made while I was on international flights. Check the flight logs," they typed rapidly, verifying. Minutes passed. Then finally, one of them exhaled a quiet, surprised laugh. "He's right." The other nodded slowly. "It matches. Someone framed you." Sarah felt her knees weaken. Aisha clapped both hands over her mouth. Li Wei sat back, eyes closing for a moment of silence that wasn't relief so much as exhaustion. "Then it's over," he whispered. "Maybe the world will breathe again." The taller man nodded. "We'll forward this to the Bureau. You'll still need to testify, but this clears most of the charges." "Thank you," Li Wei said softly. "I've waited for this breath." As the men packed up, one paused at the door. "Mr. Li," he said, "most people in your position would have run farther. Why stay?" Li Wei looked towards Sarah and Aisha. "Because I finally found somewhere worth standing still." The man smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure you get to stay." When they left, the cafe was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet, full of unspoken hope. When the door closed behind the investigators, the cafe exhaled. Sarah poured 3 cups of coffee with shaking hands. Li Wei wrapped his fingers around the mug as though anchoring himself to the moment. The steam rose between them like a soft veil. "So it's really over?" Sarah asked. Li Wei nodded slowly. "Almost. Clearing your name on paper is easy. Clearing it in people's hearts. That takes longer." Aisha leaned on the counter. "But the truth came out. Doesn't that make everything okay?" He smiled at her innocence. "Sometimes truth only repairs what's left standing after the storm." Sarah watched him, her voice gentle. "Then maybe it's time to start rebuilding." He looked at her and said quietly, "With your permission, I already have." A small silence followed, not awkward, but heavy with understanding. The storm outside had faded into drizzle, and for the first time in weeks, sunlight pressed through the clouds. It found its way through the cafe windows, glinting off the line of paper cranes. Li Wei reached for one and unfolded it carefully, flattening the creases with his palms. Inside, written in Sarah's handwriting, were the words she'd scrawled days ago without meaning to share. "Everyone deserves a place to begin again." He stared at it, eyes burning. This saved me more than you know." Sarah blinked back tears. "It was just something I wrote while thinking." "Thinking," he said softly, "is where salvation begins." At that moment, the cafe door opened again. A man in a raincoat entered, holding a small envelope. "Delivery for Mr. Li," he said. Li Wei opened it, read the brief note, and smiled faintly. "It's from the embassy," he explained. "They've confirmed the charges are dropped." Aisha jumped up and clapped. "See, I told you! I told you!" Sarah laughed through tears. "Well, Mr. Li, looks like the universe finally caught up to the truth." He stood, looking around the cafe that had become his sanctuary. "This place gave me shelter when I had nothing left. Let me give something back." He took a deep breath. "Sarah, how much do you owe on this cafe?" She blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Oh, too much, but..." Consider it paid, he said quietly. Her eyes widened. You can't— I can, he interrupted gently. Not as a gift. As an investment in kindness. You gave me warmth when I couldn't buy it. Let me make sure this place never grows cold. Tears welled in her eyes. I can't accept, he smiled. You once told me some things aren't just anything when you have nothing else. This cafe is that for you. Let me keep it alive. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Only if you promise to visit. He laughed softly. Visit? I was hoping for a permanent table, Aisha grinned. Then you can help me make more cranes. Li Wei reached into his pocket and handed her a small velvet pouch. Inside was a folded piece of jade carved into the shape of a crane. Now you'll always carry luck with you, he said. The sunlight brightened, filling the room with gold. The city outside seemed quieter, the rain almost musical against the glass. Li Wei finished his coffee and stood. I have one more thing to do before I can stay, he said. There are people I must face. Not to prove them wrong, but to tell them I forgive them. Sarah nodded. Then go and come back when you're ready. We'll keep your seat warm, he smiled. And your soup, I hope. Always, she said. He turned to Aisha. Zai Jian, he whispered. Not goodbye, she reminded him, smiling. See you again, he nodded. Yes, see you again. He stepped outside, the sunlight spilling across his face. The world somehow knew. Sarah watched him disappear into the crowd, her heart full and aching at once. Aisha ran to the window and pressed her hand against the glass. He'll come back, Mama. He always does. Sarah smiled, looking at the cranes fluttering in the faint breeze. Yes, she whispered. He will. And in that small cafe, hope returned. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Like the soft clink of a coffee cup, the quiet hum of life moving forward, and the memory of a man who found his humanity where he least expected it. The next week was the first truly clear one Seattle had seen in months. The sky stretched wide and clean. The water shimmered like glass, and for the first time in a long time, people smiled without umbrellas. But inside the city's heart, something far more important was clearing. A name. News broke quietly at first. Financial reporters who had once written Li Wei's downfall now rewrote it as his resurrection. Evidence clears. Former tycoon in global? Scandal. The same networks that had painted him as a fugitive now spoke of him as a man who refused to run from truth, but Li Wei wasn't. Watching, he was standing on the balcony of a modest apartment near the harbor, looking out at the skyline he no longer needed to conquer. His phone buzzed with congratulations from lawyers, old friends, and even strangers who now called him courageous. He didn't answer any of them. He was thinking of a waitress, a child, and a small cafe where a cup of coffee had changed everything. He took the same road back that afternoon. The sky was gold with evening, the air smelling faintly of rain and roasted beans. When he reached Harbor Light Cafe, the bell above the door greeted him like an old friend. Sarah looked up from the counter and froze, her hand still holding a dish towel. You came back, she breathed. I said I would, he replied. Aisha burst from behind the counter, running to him with unfiltered joy. You did it! Mama showed me the news. You're famous again. Li Wei crouched and smiled. Fame is noise, little one. I'd rather be remembered in silence. Sarah walked over, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. I'm glad it's over. You deserve peace. I owe that to you, he said softly. Both of you. You showed me a world that doesn't measure worth in headlines. She shook her head. We didn't do much. He looked at her with quiet certainty. You gave me something the world never did, a chance to be ordinary. They stood in silence for a moment that felt sacred. Then Li Wei pulled out a folded document and placed it on the counter. What's this? Sarah asked. He smiled. Partnership papers. I've registered the cafe under a new name. 3 Cranes Coffee, you, me, and Aisha. Her eyes widened. Li Wei, I can't— You can, he said gently. Because it was never about ownership. It's about belonging. Tears blurred her vision. Why 3 cranes? He glanced toward the window, where sunlight fell across the line of folded paper birds. Because 3 wishes saved me. One for kindness, one for courage, and one for home. Sarah laughed through her tears. You're going to make me cry in front of customers. Then let them see what real gratitude looks like, he said. They signed the papers together that evening, not in ceremony but in peace. The cafe stayed open late, filled with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. As night deepened, Li Wei sat by the window, Aisha beside him, both folding new cranes. Do you know, he said, in my country there's a legend. If you fold 1,000 cranes, your deepest wish comes true. How many do we have? She asked eagerly. 312, he said after counting. Then we need to keep folding, she declared. Because my wish isn't done yet, he smiled. And what is your wish? That you never leave again. His throat tightened. He nodded. Then we'll keep folding. Sarah watched from the counter, her heart full. She had lived most of her life believing miracles belonged to other people. Now she realized miracles didn't arrive in shining light. They walked in wet suits, asked for black coffee, and spoke softly about patience. Outside, a faint drizzle returned, gentle as a blessing. Li Wei rose, opened the window, and let a single paper crane float into the night air. It danced on the wind before disappearing toward the harbor lights. Sarah joined him at the window. Do you think it'll reach somewhere? She asked. He nodded slowly. Everything kind finds its way. Aisha pressed her face against the glass. There'll be more cranes tomorrow. Yes, Li Wei said. And everyone will carry a story worth remembering. The rain glowed under the streetlights, each drop catching the golden reflection of the cafe's sign. 3 Cranes Coffee. Inside, 3 lives, once broken and separate, had found their shape again. And as the night deepened, laughter and the smell of coffee spilled into the street. A quiet reminder that even the richest man in the world could lose everything, yet still gain the only treasure that ever truly mattered, humanity. Months passed. Seattle moved from rain to the gentle brightness of spring. The harbor smelled of salt and sun, and the once familiar gray had given way to a soft gold that wrapped the city in calm. Inside 3 Cranes Coffee, everything felt new, but comfortingly the same. The sign outside gleamed, hand-painted by a local artist who'd insisted on adding 3 small birds rising toward a distant sun. Inside, Sarah laughed more often. Aisha's drawings filled the notice board. And Li Wei, no longer a stranger, became part of the rhythm. He arrived each morning before sunrise, helping prep the kitchen, mending chairs, teaching Aisha new words from his language while the first customers trickled in. He'd learned to wipe counters with the same precision he once used to sign million-dollar contracts. Sarah often watched him from behind the espresso machine. The man who had once carried the weight of an empire now found joy in stacking pastry trays and perfecting the swirl of cream atop lattes. There was humility in his movements and peace in his silence. The cafe had changed too. Since the news of his redemption spread, curious visitors came from across the city. Journalists who once called him disgraced now wanted to feature the billionaire who rebuilt his soul in a coffee shop. Li Wei always refused interviews. The story is not about a man who fell, he would say. It's about the people who caught him. One day, an older man entered the cafe, a face Li Wei hadn't expected to see again. It was the same board member who had once looked at him across a table full of accusations. His suit was sharp, but his eyes carried guilt. Mr. Li, the man began softly. Or should I say, Li Wei, the coffee maker. Li Wei smiled faintly. Both are true. I came to apologize, the man said. We believed what they told us. I should have known better. Li Wei studied him quietly before answering. It's easy to trust noise when silence frightens you. The man lowered his gaze. If you ever want to come back, the company would... No, Li Wei interrupted gently. I'm already home. The man looked confused. Here? Li Wei nodded towards Sarah and Aisha. Here. The board member followed his gaze, then smiled sadly. I see. Then I wish you peace. You too, Li Wei said, and meant it. When the man left, Sarah came over, drying her hands on a towel. Old ghost? She asked. Li Wei nodded. But even ghosts need forgiveness, Sarah tilted her head. You always sound like you're teaching a lesson, he chuckled. Maybe I finally learned how to. That evening, after closing, they sat together by the window, the sky deepening into lavender. Aisha slept on the couch, curled up with her schoolbooks. The hum of the espresso machine was the only sound between them. Sarah sipped her coffee and said quietly, "Do you ever think about going back to that world?" Li Wei shook his head. That world was built on fear. Fear of losing what never really mattered. Here, even when I lose, I win something real, she smiled. You sound happy, he looked at her. I am. For the first time, happiness doesn't scare me. Outside, a group of teenagers passed by, laughing, the sound spilling into the cafe like sunlight through an open window. Sarah leaned her head against the glass, her eyes tired but peaceful. You know, she said softly, this place used to feel like survival. Now it feels like living. Li Wei glanced at the cranes by the window, now almost 1,000. That's because you turned struggle into grace, Sarah laughed. Grace? Hardly. More like stubbornness. Sometimes they're the same thing, he said. She looked at him then, really looked. The lines on his face seemed softer, the weariness replaced by calm strength. You're not the man who walked in here that night. No, he said quietly. That man was a prisoner. I'm free. They sat in silence as the sky dimmed and the harbor lights blinked on, one by one. Inside the small cafe, time slowed again. For Li Wei, it was enough just to be there, to breathe, to listen, to exist without performance. And for Sarah, it was enough to see him smile. By summer, Three Cranes Coffee had become more than a cafe. It was a refuge, a quiet sanctuary tucked between glass towers and gray skies. Locals called it the place that feels like sunlight. Strangers came not just for coffee but for conversation, for the rare comfort of being seen. Li Wei never advertised the place. He said the right people would find it when they needed it most, and somehow, they did. Office workers came to escape their screens. Taxi drivers stopped by at dawn for the first brew of the day. College students studying late would pause to ask Li Wei about the paper cranes lining the window. He told them each crane held a story, a reminder that patience and small gestures could change lives. Soon, customers began bringing their own cranes. The window display grew until it shimmered like a mosaic of color, blue, gold, red, white, every fold a different heartbeat. Sarah sometimes joked that the cafe looked like a shrine. Li Wei would just smile. A shrine to ordinary miracles, he'd say. Word spread. Articles began to appear online. From billionaire to barista, the man who found redemption in coffee. Journalists came with cameras and microphones, but Li Wei spoke sparingly. He didn't talk about money or betrayal. He talked about kindness, about Aisha, about how a simple greeting in a foreign language could save a man's soul. One afternoon, a group of business students from the university came in to interview him. The leader, a confident young man in a blazer, asked, Mr. Li, if you could give one piece of advice to future entrepreneurs, what would it be? Li Wei smiled thoughtfully. Build something that can survive your absence. Money doesn't do that. People do. They wrote it down as if it were a business strategy, not realizing it was a confession. A few days later, Sarah noticed something different about him. He spent long moments standing outside looking at the sign, his eyes distant. When she asked what he was thinking, he said, It's strange. For years, I believed legacy was made of buildings and numbers. Now I see it's made of faces and laughter. She smiled. Then you've already built the best kind. But Li Wei's peace wasn't without shadows. Sometimes, late at night, he would linger by the harbor alone. He'd watch the cargo ships glide across the water, their lights winking in the dark. Somewhere among them, he imagined, were the remnants of the empire he'd lost. And yet, instead of bitterness, he felt gratitude. Loss had been the doorway through which he'd stepped into a truer life. One evening, as he returned to the cafe, he found a letter taped to the door. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, precise, his former assistant's. I read about you. They know I forged your signature. I'm sorry. I can't undo what I did. I only hope you find peace. There was no return address. Li Wei folded the letter carefully and placed it inside one of the cranes. Sarah noticed his expression but didn't ask. She had learned that some wounds healed best in silence. Later that week, Aisha organized what she called the Cranes of Hope Day. She invited the neighborhood children to the cafe to fold cranes and hang them by the windows. The place filled with laughter, paper, and the rustle of wings. Li Wei moved through the room, helping little hands make perfect folds, teaching them the patience of one crease at a time. "It's like life," he told them. "You can't rush beauty. You have to fold it slowly." Sarah watched him with pride. There was no trace of the man who once measured his worth by stock prices. He had become a teacher, a mentor, a quiet force of grace. That night, when the children had gone home and the cafe was still again, Sarah lit a small candle on the counter. "For all the people who walk in and find themselves," she said softly. Li Wei looked at her and nodded. "And for all the ones still wandering." They sat together until closing. The candle's flame reflected in the window, flickering among the 1,000 paper cranes that shimmered like stars caught in glass. Outside, the city glowed with its usual rhythm. But inside Three Cranes Coffee, time moved differently. It breathed, it healed, it transformed. Autumn came quietly, brushing the city with bronze leaves and the scent of rain. The cranes in the window now numbered past 1,000, each one a soft whisper of someone's story. Some were from regular customers, some from travelers passing through, others mailed from people Li Wei had never met but whose lives had been touched by his journey. Every morning, Sarah would find new envelopes under the door. Letters came from across the country. Students, workers, strangers who had read about Three Cranes Coffee and found hope in its story. One letter said, "Your cafe saved my son's life. He read about you and decided not to give up." Another read, "Thank you for reminding us that grace doesn't need wealth to shine." Li Wei never replied to them individually. Instead, he framed them, hanging each one on the back wall. The cafe had become a living testimony, every letter and crane a thread in a tapestry of quiet redemption. One afternoon, as the first cold wind swept through the city, Aisha ran into the cafe holding her school report. "Mama, Mr. Li!" "Look, I got top marks in English." Li Wei smiled, setting aside the ledger he'd been balancing. "I knew you would." "You speak from the heart." Sarah ruffled her daughter's hair. "That's because she listens more than she talks sometimes." Aisha grinned. "Mr. Li says listening is like reading without a book." Sarah chuckled. "And what book are you reading now, Aisha pointed toward Li Wei. "His." They all laughed, and for a moment, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. 3 lives stitched together by chance. Love and something beyond explanation. That evening, as they closed up, Li Wei stood at the door watching the reflection of the cafe's light spill onto the wet street. "You know," he said, "when I built skyscrapers, I thought light was just electricity. Now I understand it's a choice." Sarah looked up from wiping the counter. "A choice?" "Yes," he said softly. "To stay open when it's easier to close. To forgive when it's easier to forget. To keep shining even when the world turns away." She smiled. "Then this place will never go dark," he nodded. "Not while we're in it." In late November, an international documentary team arrived, asking to film a short segment about Three Cranes Coffee. Sarah hesitated, but Li Wei agreed, on one condition. "Tell it not as the story of a man who fell," he said, "but of a child who reminded him how to stand." During the interview, the director asked Aisha, "What did you do that changed him?" Aisha thought for a moment. "I just said hello in his language," she answered simply. "Sometimes people need to hear kindness in words they understand." The director smiled, and Li Wei blinked away a tear he didn't try to hide. That simple sentence became the film's title, Hello in His Language. When it aired, the world paused. Millions watched the story of a fallen billionaire and the waitress's daughter who saved him with 3 small words. Donations poured into global charities in Li Wei's name. Schools in both China and the United States began exchange programs titled The Three Cranes Project, teaching cultural empathy and resilience. But for Li Wei, the real victory remained small and personal. He still swept the floors after closing, still poured the first cup of the day for Sarah, still folded a crane whenever he felt gratitude swell too large to speak. On the first anniversary of the cafe's renaming, the three of them stood outside under a light drizzle. The sign gleamed, raindrops sliding down its carved edges. Sarah looked at him. "Do you ever wish things had happened differently?" Li Wei thought for a long moment. "If they hadn't, I would never have met you," she smiled softly. "Then I guess the universe knew what it was doing." He nodded. "Sometimes the fall is the only way to see the ground." Aisha tugged his sleeve. "We still fold cranes every year, right?" "Every year," he promised. "Until the sky runs out of room." They released a handful together that night. The paper wings rose, bright against the dark, floating over the harbor lights before dissolving into the mist. Inside, the cafe glowed, warm, alive, eternal. On the door, the reflection of its golden letters shimmered. 3 Cranes Coffee, a place for new beginnings. And within its walls, love had rewritten the story of loss, turning it into a legacy of light. Years drifted by like the tide outside the harbor. The cranes in the cafe windows faded from bright colors to gentle pastels, their paper edges curled by sunlight. They were old now, but so was the story they carried, and both had only grown more beautiful with time. Li Wei's hair had turned silver at the edges, but his eyes remained alive with quiet fire. Every morning he still opened the cafe, lit the warm lamps, and brewed the first pot himself. 3 Cranes Coffee had become a landmark, not because of fame, but because of the way people felt when they stepped inside. It smelled of forgiveness, of second chances, of lives rebuilt one cup at a time. Aisha had grown tall. Her laughter was deeper now, but it still carried that same light. She was finishing high school and preparing to study international relations on a scholarship named after the cafe, the 3 Cranes Exchange Grant. The funding came, of course, from Li Wei's foundation, which he had quietly created to connect students from different worlds. The day before she left for college, she sat with Li Wei by the window where everything had begun. "Do you think people really change, Mr. Li?" she asked. He smiled. "They don't change. They become who they were meant to be once the noise fades." She tilted her head. "Then who were you meant to be?" He looked out at the harbor, where sunlight danced across the waves. A man who lost everything he never needed, so he could find everything he couldn't live without. Aisha nodded, trying to lock the words in her memory. "You always make life sound like poetry." He chuckled softly. "It only sounds that way when it's finally honest." Sarah joined them, carrying 3 cups of coffee, his black, hers with cream, Aisha's with too much sugar as always. "Your plane's early tomorrow," she said to her daughter. "You'd better start packing." "I know," Aisha said, then looked at Li Wei. "Promise you'll visit?" He nodded. "I'll come when the cranes reach 2,000. We'll release them together." That night, after the cafe closed, Sarah found Li Wei sitting alone. The lights were dim, the city outside hushed beneath a light rain. "You'll miss her," she said. He smiled without looking up. "She's the future. We're just the pages she'll write on." Sarah sat beside him. "You gave her more than you realize." He turned to her, voice low. "You both gave me back my name. Not the one in the newspapers, the one that means something." She touched his hand. "You earned it." He looked at her, the gratitude in his eyes wordless. For a long while they just sat, listening to the soft hum of the city. Years later, long after Aisha had graduated, 3 Cranes Coffee expanded quietly. There was another shop in Shanghai now and one in Beijing. But they weren't franchises, they were sanctuaries. Each one displayed the same 1,000 cranes, each with a story attached. People came not for luxury, but for reflection. Li Wei returned to China once a year. He'd walk through the streets he once ruled and smile at how different it all felt. Power no longer tempted him. Peace did. He met young entrepreneurs who spoke his name with reverence, asking for business secrets. He told them the same thing every time. Success is what you keep when money leaves. Everything else is noise. When he returned to Seattle, the cafe greeted him like an old friend. Sarah's hair had streaks of gray now, but her smile hadn't dimmed. Together they managed the shop like clockwork, the rhythm of their lives woven into every cup they poured. One evening, Aisha returned from abroad, standing in the doorway with that same spark in her eyes. "I miss this place," she said. Li Wei rose to hug her. "And we missed our light." She looked around at the walls, now filled with letters, photos, stories from people all over the world. "You built something bigger than you knew," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "We did." They sat for hours, talking and laughing until the candles burned low. Before she left again, Aisha placed a new crane in the window, made of gold paper. On its wings, she had written one sentence: "Kindness is the only currency that never devalues." Months later, on a quiet spring morning, Sarah walked into the café to find Li Wei sitting by the window, head bowed, hands folded over a small paper crane. He looked peaceful, as if simply resting. A single note lay on the table beside his empty cup. "Thank you for the home you didn't know you gave me." The city paused that day. Newspapers printed tributes, but Sarah didn't read them. She just opened the cafe as usual, lit the lamps, and set a fresh cup of coffee at his seat. Aisha flew in 2 days later. Together they folded one last crane, wrote Zaijian on its wings, and released it into the morning sky. It soared high above the harbor before vanishing into sunlight. Years passed. The cafe stayed open. The cranes multiplied. People still came to feel what couldn't be described: hope, warmth, the weightless silence of being understood. Children grew up hearing the legend of the man who had once been a billionaire and became something richer, a human being who learned that the smallest kindness could rebuild a soul. And above the door, the sign still gleamed, worn smooth by weather but unchanging in spirit. 3 Cranes Coffee, where hellos change lives.